So actually, you mentioned the key word, United Nations, and we have the right man coming in the right moment. This is Professor Jarro, who just joined us, and he will be the one who will be handling UN-related issues. Here, I'm a traffic cop, a facilitator. I'm not representing the views of the United Nations or any of its specialized agencies. I'm just an agent provocateur. So please forgive me if I'm asking tough questions. But where Vincent has left, that a better focus of the UN. Well, indeed, all of you came from areas, even the Scots actually, came from areas that are shared watersheds, shared by more than, well, 2 or more nations. And then we have not many legal instruments which are dealing with shared watersheds. Perhaps you remember there is one, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Non-Navigational Use of Transboundary Water Courses, this famous 1997 convention that has been adopted by the UN General Assembly after 27 years of negotiations. And it's not yet in force. So it's a part of the international legal body, but there are some of the upstream countries who are saying that, well, this convention is not in conformity with the principle of absolute sovereignty over our natural resources. But there are some who are the downstream countries who are saying that, well, that's fine, but it doesn't mean that the upstream country can do whatever they wish. Now comes the nasty comment, is that if you look at that groundwater resources are at least by 1 order of magnitude more complicated than surface water issues when it comes to the transboundary context, then some of the cynics are saying that to come up with a United Nations instrument would take 270 years. Knowing the UN, that could happen, actually. Nevertheless, what happens is that we have, after 6 years of discussions, the legal elements of a legal instrument that help to manage transboundary aquifers. So let us move over to this issue of shared basins. What is your view? Why is it that this UN convention, which is not a very powerful convention in terms of legal restrictions, it's rather a framework, but it's still not yet in power, and we had now 15 years after it has been adopted. What is your reading? Why did that happen? I don't know, Michel, but I would like to make a comment on this, or not at this one. Anybody in the panel? Yes, please, Francisco, go ahead.
Well, there are 2 words that I was expecting to hear in this debate, and in fact they were pronounced already, and they relate very much to your question. One is scale, the other one is sovereignty. Those are 2 factors that make water governance and global water governance a quite difficult issue, and somehow difficult to put in place. And the example that you just gave of a convention that is waiting for, what, 25 years to be implemented, that's just a good, not 25, 12 years to be implemented after 27 years of negotiation, is just a very good example of those barriers. First of all, the question of scale. Well, when you talk about climate change, for instance, it's very clearly a global problem. I mean, there's no sense in avoiding emissions here and not there, because all goes into the atmosphere, all have approximately the same impact. Of course, when it comes to adaptation, it's very case-specific, and the differences are very, very important. But the phenomenon itself, it's very global in nature, and the solution needs to be global. It's a global scale in the problem itself. When it comes to water, it's much more complex. Of course, the inputs, the meteorology is quite global. Ultimately, climate is global. But that's the input, because the water you use is not the atmospheric branch of the hydrological cycle. What you use is the terrestrial, be it surface or groundwater. And that's very much local, the point of abstraction, let's say, or regional, the river basin and the solidarity that you need to have, or you should have, in the river basin. And that's local, that's regional. At most, that's transboundary, but even transboundary is 2, 3, 4 nations. Well, in some cases a little bit more, but a few nations. In other words, the problems that Portugal has with Spain has, in principle, little to do with the problems of Mexico and the United States, or Brazil and Paraguay, or whatever. Those are very specific local problems, specific to one river basin. Of course, you can compare them, you have problems that you can find a little bit everywhere, but they are faced and solved locally by nations, by governments, 2, 3, 4 governments. So, problem of scale is extremely important and makes water a little bit difficult to address, because you have, of course, the global level of the problem, and you have the climate, and you have all that, but then you have point of abstraction, the quantity, the quality in this point to serve this population, and that's very, very local, or at least is seen as very local. Of course, depends very much on more regional and global phenomena, but is perceived as very local. So that's one barrier, I think, that we should be aware of to overcome. The other barrier, you mentioned it, and our Brazilian colleague mentioned it already, is the problem of sovereignty, absolute territorial sovereignty. Water is perceived as part of your land. That happens in the national case. For instance, in northern Portugal, the value of land is very much associated to the water that you can access. So water should be seen as something flowing through your property, but it is, on the opposite, it is seen as something belonging to your property that you don't want to wave away. And it happens the same with nations. Upstream and downstream is very different point of view. Okay. And we know that Portugal is very much a downstream country. We have a very good relationship with Spain. Spain is 100% an upstream country. I insist, we have a very good relationship, but we know the difference. We know very well the difference of a downstream country, an upstream country, and how they perceive problems very different. And that's another barrier to overcome, to proceed. So maybe that's one reason why we need global water governance. If we don't look at that governance as a government, as something to tell us what to do, but as something to give us goals, common targets, give us some, level of performance that we should try to achieve. In that sense, I think that could help to overcome these barriers.
Well, thank you. But, you mentioned that, these problems are rather site-specific. Yet there is something generic in there, which is that water connects, it doesn't divide. So how that principle could be encapsulated in the legal systems, that's an interesting thing. All the more so as the future is not going to be the same as the past. But we are living in a non-stationary world. So how do you adjust your legal instruments? Perhaps, Alistair, you may wish to have something, and we come back to you then. Yeah. Alistair?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really interesting. I think it really gets to the heart of global governance. This issue around the Watercourses Convention, the '97 Watercourses Convention, because as you say, it was a long time in its development. It was the International Law Commission originally that drafted the articles. It was an expert body, but states had a number of opportunities to comment on the scope, content of those draft articles before they got to the General Assembly. Then, within the General Assembly, the Sixth Committee, they were negotiated by states. Pretty tough negotiations, word for word. When you think people say laws don't count, well, people really think about what they're saying in the text of legal agreements, and the convention was a case of in point there. And that was 1997, and it still hasn't entered into force. It's I think, a great representation of the best you can do. It's not going to be perfect, but at a global level, it was the best that you could do in 1997. And in fact, in some instances, I would say it's quite surprising. it's not often mentioned. A lot of the focus is around equity, equitable and reasonable utilization, no significant harm. But the convention actually has a strong provision on the protection of ecosystems. I think that's excellent. I think that's at the heart of how we should look at it. I think when we're developing concepts around ecosystem services, we haven't looked at it that much in a transboundary context. I think it has a lot of potential. But that focus on the protection of ecosystems, I think it brings in an ecosystem-based approach within that convention. And as you said, Andras, it's general. It lacks detail, but it's a global convention. So I think we can leave a detail to the basin level. But what I would say is that what the convention, and the reason that it hasn't entered in force, really represents a crisis of global water governance. Because I've done a lot of work on the convention. I've done a lot of awareness-raising workshops at the national level, looking at it more at the global level, the strengths and weaknesses. And what we found is that okay, so some states have issues with the content, but the vast majority of states, 103 or 106, depending how you want to look at it, states voted in favor of the content of that convention in 1997. They decided to adopt it.
All right.
So how has that that hasn't translated into formal ratifications? And just one last point. A lot of the reasons we've found has not been about the content. It's really about a lack of a champion, where other multilateral conventions have had champions pushing the convention. The 97 water courses hasn't. There's a lack of awareness of the content of the convention, and I think these sort of issues, and that kind of links back to the need for global leadership there, and within water governance has been lacking for the last few years. But now we're seeing that it's being picked up, and there's more and more with greater awareness around the convention. More and more states are willing to formally ratify it, and formal ratification makes a difference. Well,
that's exactly the point. The other day I had a chat with a parliamentarian and then asked him that, why didn't you go ahead? This is so relatively simple as compared to other laws. He said, oh, well, we are terribly busy and we don't have this pressure by and from society. And that's exactly what these fora are all about, is to increase the awareness amongst the politicians, including the parliamentarians, that this is a very, very urgent issue. Vincenta, please go ahead. You wanted to say a few things.
Eu gostaria. Nós temos ditado no Brasil que diz que o diabo mora nos detalhes. E nesse caso, especificamente sobre essa convenção, nós temos duas questões que eu acho que são elementos que dificultam a sua ratificação. O primeiro deles é o conceito, e daí, inclusive, a minha primeira preocupação em não adotar o termo da governança global da água. Quando nós tratamos de rios internacionais, para o nosso país, o conceito de rios internacionais é conflitante com a soberania perante seus recursos naturais. Então, o termo, bacias transfronteiriças, numa convenção como essa, e isso não é um detalhe, é conceito do país, poderia, em certa medida, facilitar o processo da sua aprovação. A segunda é com relação à definição de obrigações. Então, com relação a convenções que impõem obrigações e obrigações naturais definidas por aqueles que estão a jusante e a montante no rio, isso, sem dúvida nenhuma, também é um elemento que dificulta. Então, na minha opinião, no momento atual, nós deveríamos aprender com a água, e muito embora seja possível romper esses obstáculos, é muito mais rápido nós contornarmos e ajustarmos para aquilo que mais efetivamente nós necessitamos. Nós não necessitamos de novos problemas, nem necessitamos de novos conceitos. O que nós estamos necessitando são de soluções para diagnósticos que, quando a gente lê a convenção que você mencionou de 77, são diagnósticos persistentes, são diagnósticos que se apresentam de maneira contínua, há melhoria na situação internacional, mas essa melhoria é muito lenta. Então, do nosso ponto de vista, nós precisaríamos buscar o mais rapidamente possível acordos sobre quais as nossas necessidades e buscarmos soluções para essas necessidades, mais do que o aprimoramento de alguns conceitos, como, por exemplo, a questão da governança global da água, que pode esbarrar na mesma questão que envolve o conceito de rios internacionais, que vários países, eu acredito, mas no caso brasileiro, têm divergências com esse conceito de maneira geral.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us play for a moment the role of a national assembly or a parliament. And there are hundreds of different fractions and parties. And the speaker comes with the proposal that who would go for the ratification of the 1997 convention? And then I would like to, just as a test and for fun, to see what is the feeling of the audience. Those who would, if you were a parliamentarian and if we were a national assembly, who would vote for the ratification of the 97 convention here? Up your hands. No, don't be shy, don't be shy. There's no court case followed. Well, you guys are not that many, as is like a good 20%. Well, yeah, just a minute. Now, let me just ask the opposite. Who would vote against the ratification? 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, you are minority. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the thing. And we will come back to that, and then I certainly would like to listen to the arguments of both parties. But let us move on now, capitalizing on the fact that the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization and the chair of the UN Water is with us. Let us move over now to what Vincent has mentioned, the role of the United Nations in water, the role of the United Nations in global water governance. What is it what the UN ought to do? We have seen on the one hand that the legal instruments are there, yet they're not yet enforced. There's a need for 35 countries to ratify the treaty, and we are not yet there after 15 years. So some of the countries are saying, forget it. Some others are urging the adoption. So what can the UN do in this particular situation? You also have to recognize two things. One is that often people are horrified when they hear that there are 29 United Nations agencies involved in water. And this is terrible, and then governments are coming and bashing the UN, that the UN is not being effective, they have to be more active in coordinating their role, which is fine up to a certain extent, but they tend to forget that the UN is a mirror image of the national governments. That is why FAO has a program, because the Ministry of Agriculture have water programs. That is why UNIDO has a water program, because the Ministry of Industries have an industrial water program. This is why UNESCO has a water program, because the Ministry of Sciences have a hydrological research programs. WMO is, of course, a very special agency, because it's a very concrete that deals with meteorology. That is why UNEP has a water program, because that has water has an environmental aspect. That is why UNDP has a water program, because water has a developmental context. So from whatever direction you look at it, it's a very complex thing. So how do we get that business run more effectively? Perhaps should we move over and have one United Nations agency? And the Y generation here perhaps remembers that way back in 1977, this was one of the recommendations of the Mar del Plata Conference. The same way as in 1972, when the United Nations Conference on the Environment was held, a proposal came to create a United Nations body that deals with environment. This is how our brothers and sisters at UNEP were created. But came the second oil crisis, and the UN water as an agency got off the agenda. nobody ever talked about it. So ever since then, governments are speaking, you have to cooperate more, you have to be more effective. But at the same time, they do not provide the resources to do that more effective work. So it's a very complex conundrum. And I would like to hear the views of the